Charlie, what we'd like to first bring up, the first instance we'd like to bring up with you, you understand you've been charged with 2 crimes, correct?
Murder and attempted murder.
Murder and attempted murder. Do you understand, or do you know who the victims of both those charges refer to?
I do now. I didn't know the second one until you told me a little while ago.
Imagine you're in a hospital, a place where safety and healing are supposed to be guaranteed, at least to the best of the people around you's ability. But what if the very person entrusted with your care is secretly trying to kill you? For 16 years, one unassuming nurse hopped from hospital to hospital, leaving a trail of death so vast it would take decades to uncover the full scope of the chilling crimes. This is Red Rum. Stories about the true victims of crime. I upload 2, 3, sometimes 4 times a week, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss an episode. I use news archives, documentary footage and books to research these cases, so the episodes are accurate to the source material I can find. This case starts the way they often do, which is quietly. There were whispers in hospital corridors, puzzled looks exchanged during staff meetings, and nervous jokes over cafeteria coffee. Nurses and doctors noticed strange things happening on their wards. Patients who were stable would suddenly crash, and the timings didn't make sense. The deaths didn't make any sense at all. But if you've ever been unfortunate enough to be in a hospital or be visiting someone there, you will know these places are chaotic, they're messy, things go wrong. Sometimes people die even when they shouldn't. So for years, those whispers stayed as just that. They were just whispers. Up until a point in 2003, and that was because it was happening so often, it was becoming impossible to ignore. In December of 2003, a small hospital in New Jersey called Somerset Medical Center was really just struggling to figure out exactly what was happening to their patients. And this was all because of one nurse, Charles Cullen, or Charlie Cullen. Now, on the surface, Charlie was quiet, he was unassuming, he was soft-spoken, he was described as being, quote, forgettable. He'd been a nurse for nearly 16 years and he hopped from one hospital to the next across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Now, his colleagues did sometimes think he was a little bit odd. He didn't really tend to socialise much and he had quite a dark sense of humour. But really, no one thought much of it until, that is, patients started dying and dying and dying. In the ICU at Somerset, the pattern that was emerging was really quite hard to ignore. Patients would suddenly flatline, often in the middle of the night. And when doctors ordered toxicology reports or they reviewed charts, they noticed that strange abnormalities were popping up. There were elevated levels of digoxin, which is this medication that's used to treat conditions of the heart, but it can be deadly in the wrong hands. And that drug was showing up in multiple patients who hadn't been prescribed it. The hospital administrators, they didn't notify law enforcement. Not yet. And we've heard of this happening before. If you've ever listened to Dr. Death, excellent podcast by the way, or if you've heard about that case just more generally, you might remember that one of the reasons he got away with doing it for so long was because even though hospitals had their suspicions, in some cases they had evidence, they knew outright what he was doing, they didn't want to get in trouble, they didn't want to get sued. So they'd just make him leave. Sometimes they'd fire him, essentially, or make him kind of just have to move on or resign himself. But they wouldn't tell any authoritative body. So he would just go from hospital to hospital, making the same mistakes, making the same decisions. And eventually he ended up killing people because of his negligence, because of his decisions. So instead, the hospital administrators didn't tell the authorities. And that is when a nurse called Amy came in to review some medical records. Now, Amy had always thought Charlie was a little eccentric, but harmless. She considered him a friend. But when she was presented with these documents, these charts, her stomach dropped. She could see it very clearly. She found this trail of unprescribed medications, insulin and digoxin, along with other drugs as well, and they had no business being administered to these particular patients. Now, as she pieced this together, this horrible possibility emerged. And at this point, law enforcement were involved, and they told her that Charlie wasn't making mistakes. He was killing people, and they needed her help in exposing him. Charlie's life had always been extremely chaotic. He was born in 1960 in West Orange, New Jersey, and he was the youngest of 8 children in this really turbulent household. His father had died when he was just 7 months old, and his mother then died in a car crash when he was a teenager. And this is a loss that he just never recovered from. Unsurprising, really. I don't know that you ever recover from something like that. You just kind of learn how to build your life around that hole. But then by his early 20s, Charlie was still not coping well at all, and he'd actually attempted to take his life a number of times. Despite his instability, Charlie managed to graduate from nursing school in 1986. This was a profession that gave him power, it gave him access, and it gave him trust. It gave him everything he needed to end up becoming one of the deadliest killers in American history. Now, before Charlie became one of America's most prolific spree killers, he appeared to lead a seemingly normal life. In 1987, he ended up marrying a woman called Adrienne Baum, and she was a nurse at a hospital. The couple got married, they went on to have 2 daughters. One was born in 1987 and then the other was born a few years later. And family life seemed pretty ordinary. They lived together in New Jersey and Charlie was there just kind of holding down a steady job as a nurse. But behind closed doors, Charlie's personality began to show signs of his darker side. Although he appeared to be this loving husband and father, Charlie's behaviour was actually increasingly erratic. He became emotionally distant, irritable, and just withdrawn altogether. His violent tendencies were already beginning to surface, but his ability to kind of try and hide his true nature, that would allow him to continue working as a nurse and continue appearing to lead a normal life, all while continuing this killing spree. As the years went on, Adrienne, her suspicions grew about her husband's increasingly strange behaviour. The strain in their marriage became evident, and by 1993 they actually got a divorce. The relationship had become so bad that a restraining order was actually taken out against Charlie by Adrienne after he had threatened her. Still, at this point, Adrienne had no idea about the horrific crimes that Charlie had begun committing. It wouldn't be until 2003, when his arrest made headlines, that Adrienne actually learnt the chilling truth, that Charlie, the man she'd been married to and loved, was a spree killer. Their daughters, who were children when Charlie's crimes came to light, were left absolutely devastated by the revelation that their own father, his actions had meant that people had died. He was heartless, he was cold, and he just wasn't the man that they thought he was. Now, with that context of Charlie and his personal life and the kind of descent into murder, we can now look at the details of what actually happened. Charlie's first murder happened at St. Barnabas Medical Center in New Jersey, and this was in 1988. Charlie was fresh out of nursing school. He had just started this job, and back then he was described as being a little bit awkward, quite quiet and shy, but nothing about him set off any alarms for any of his colleagues. On the critical care floor where he was working, there was a 72-year-old man called John Yengo Sr., and he'd been in there because he was recovering from this routine surgery. He was a retired judge. He was loved by many people, and John was expected to make a full recovery. His family came to visit him often, and they were reassured by doctors that he was going to be fine. Things were looking good, until suddenly they weren't. One morning, John's heart just stopped. Nurses and doctors rushed to his room and tried to save him, but no matter what they did, nothing seemed to work. And just like that, John was gone. The doctors called it a tragic complication, one of those rare, unexpected turns that happened in hospitals from time to time. His family, of course, were devastated and they mourned. They never expected that John's death was anything other than an accident really. But Charlie knew the truth. He'd been the one to inject John's IV bag with a dose of digoxin that was fatal. He'd been by his bedside, he'd watched the monitor, and then he'd just walked away knowing exactly what was going to happen next. But the most chilling part is that at this point, no one noticed. No one was looking for a murderer, so no one even saw that the IV bag had been tampered with. Over the next 4 years, patients at St. Barnabas continued to die unexpectedly. Charlie, however, kept a really low profile. He really tried to blend in with his colleagues. And meanwhile, there was a noticing factor of people seeing that there were more deaths than usual, but they kind of just chalked it up to a bad time in the hospital. It was just one of those things. But then nurses began finding IV bags with small puncture marks in them, which was a clear sign of tampering, though it seems that nothing at that point was done. In some of the source materials that I read, it said that in these cases, Charlie was suspected straight away, but an investigation just wasn't launched, and instead the hospital just let him go. And this pattern would repeat over and over. Whenever Charlie, his actions, his behaviour, whenever they became worrying, he would be dismissed, but hospitals would choose the path of least resistance. And this would happen over and over again. It allowed him to resign and gave him a neutral reference as well, which meant that he would just move on to the next place and continue what he was doing, and no one would be any the wiser. For years, these deaths were written off as medical mystery. The families of these victims never imagined that this was the beginning of what would become a 16-year killing spree. And for Charlie, John had been the first. There are a number of other unconfirmed but very likely deaths, but he would go on to kill a whole load more people. And as is the nature of this case, there are going to be a lot of victims that we just don't know the details of. We still don't know how many exactly he killed. But we do know about the next documented case. It's a 77-year-old woman called Millie McCain. She was admitted to St. Barnabas in 1991, and she'd come in for heart problems. She was having treatment for that. Now, Millie had been experiencing chronic health issues, but she wasn't in any immediate danger of dying. At some point during her stay, Charlie administered a fatal dose of digoxin. That's the medication that is used to treat heart conditions, like heart failure, for example. That's what it's used for when it's correctly dosed. It can help stabilise the heart's rhythm. But in high doses, it can be lethal. It basically can cause your heart to, forgive me, any doctors out there, this is what I've researched, it slows down the rate so much that it can cause cardiac arrest. Charlie didn't record that drug that he'd given her. Now, obviously, you're supposed to write everything down in the patient's chart, but a signature of the murders that Charlie committed was that he would skip this step for obvious reasons. Of course, this made it difficult to track his involvement in each patient's end. And so this was one of the reasons it was so much harder to catch him. Shortly after Charlie gave Millie that fatal dose, her heart began to fail. Symptoms of this kind of toxicity likely set in very rapidly, and they'd be things like nausea, dizziness, and just general worsening fatigue, really. And of course, Charlie would have seen this all happening. He knew exactly what to do to save her, and he said nothing. When Millie's death was recorded, it was noted that she had died because of complications from her pre-existing heart condition. In a busy hospital setting, deaths of elderly patients with cardiac issues are fairly normal. They're not unusual, at least, and Charlie knew that. He played on the assumption that no one was going to question it, and so Charlie was free to go on to continue his killing spree with no one really questioning him. No one knew he'd had anything to do with Millie's death, and no one knew Millie's death was suspicious. This case, along with the others that followed, began to form a really chilling pattern. Charlie was not targeting people who were critically ill or even close to death. He was taking advantage of vulnerable patients, oftentimes those who were seemingly recovering. His ability to make a death appear natural was one of the key reasons why he was able to operate undetected in all of these cases. And this would continue for a long time. After Millie's murder, Charlie went on to work at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey. It was whilst he was there that he met a woman called Helen Dean. This was in 1993, so just 2 years later, after the murder we just spoke about with Millie. And Helen had come in for a breast cancer surgery. And this case is really where the red flags started to be raised. And this is because Helen's son, Larry, was aware, he was well aware of his mum's condition and that she was going in for this kind of routine surgery. She would most likely come out as predicted. She'd take some time to recover and then she would continue on with her life. Helen was this really sharp, independent woman. She knew herself, and at 91 years old, she showed no signs of slowing down. It was in 1993 that she was admitted into Warren Hospital for this surgery, and everything had actually gone well with the surgery itself. But during her post-op recovery, Helen found herself in a hospital room and Charlie entered, and she was alone at this point. Now, Charlie came over and he administered her an injection. And this was the first time he'd done it in this way. Before, he had tampered with the IV bag, for example. But this time, he had injected it directly into Helen's body. This case is one of the rare ones where Charlie's victim actually seemed to sense that something was wrong. She knew she was in some kind of danger. Now, at first, there was nothing unusual about Charlie being in her hospital room. Nurses and doctors came in frequently. It's a hospital setting, that wasn't abnormal. But as Charlie approached her bed, Helen could not shake this feeling of unease. Perhaps it was his demeanour, maybe he was cold or detached or in a hurry. Maybe it was something she just couldn't quite put her finger on. In that moment, Charlie pulled out that syringe and Helen watched him closely and asked what he was doing. She was alert enough to know that she wasn't scheduled for any injections or anything like that. No one had mentioned this to her. Charlie did not respond in a way that reassured her. Instead, without much explanation, he just administered that injection to her. And of course, we know now that he was giving her that fatal amount of digoxin. As soon as the needle left her skin, Helen's unease grew into outright fear. She just knew something wasn't right and she could feel it. The sensation wasn't just physical, it was deeply instinctual. She was even aware enough to tell her family members about this injection a little while later when she saw them. And she even described the nurse who had given it to her, quote, "He shouldn't have done that." She had told her son, Larry, and he immediately raised concerns with the hospital. He was adamant that that injection was not routine. He demanded answers. They didn't really think there had been anything wrong, but Helen's deterioration then really solidified his suspicions. Hours later, Helen's heart began to fail. The digoxin that was now coursing through her body disrupted the heart's rhythm, and it led to her death. Now, despite Larry saying that this was unusual and he demanded an investigation actually, the hospital just dismissed his claims. They ruled her death as natural. Tragic, yes, but an unremarkable consequence of her age and her recent surgery. I think Helen's death is one of the most haunting in this series of murders because she knew something was wrong. Her instincts told her, but by then it was too late. The system should have protected her. The hospital, the nurses and doctors, they failed her completely. When she said something was wrong, they did not listen to her. What made Charlie so terrifying was his ability to blend in. And also, his methods were completely unpredictable. There is a sheer randomness in how he picks his victims. In the months after Helen's murder, Charlie did remain at Warren Hospital and he continued working completely unnoticed. And then his next victim walked into where he was working. It was Father Florian Gall, and he had come into the hospital with this heart condition. Father Gall had spent his life comforting others in their darkest moments, and now, in his time of desperate need, he had placed his trust in hospital staff. And unfortunately, at this point, that was Charlie. Now, Father Gall's condition was not immediately life-threatening. He was being monitored, he was being stabilised, and he was expected to recover. But you can see where this is going. Charlie had other plans. Without any justification, he administered digoxin. Charlie honed in on Father Gall's pre-existing heart conditions and he used them to his advantage. And sadly, this murder again would be easily dismissed as a natural death. Father Gall's death, which was sudden and unexplained, sent these ripples of emotion and grief through the community. He was well known, he was well loved, and he was not expected to die. But for Warren Hospital, they barely raised an eyebrow. It was simply logged as another person in a long line of patients who had come in sick and then just left in a body bag. They didn't seem to care. And then this is where things shifted a little bit, because Charlie's method changed. He started using insulin. Now, I know this drug from its function in diabetes, but Charlie knew that this drug could be just as deadly as digoxin. And so he started to secretly inject different patients with high doses, and it would cause their blood sugar to plummet dangerously, and then they would slip into a hypoglycemic coma. And they then suffer this really long, agonising last few moments, last few days before they would eventually die. After he'd started using insulin, he actually moved on from Warren to Morristown Memorial Hospital. And this is where Charlie targeted a woman called Edna Powers. Edna was this retired woman, and she was admitted for minor complications related to diabetes. Edna's condition wasn't critical, and her family were really optimistic that she was gonna make a full recovery. But then one night, Edna's blood sugar levels dropped rapidly. The hospital staff scrambled to stabilise her, but her decline was so sudden and so rapid that there was nothing they could do. Edna died in her hospital bed, and her death was put down to complications from diabetes. Of course, what no one realised at the time was that Charlie had deliberately injected her with insulin, knowing it would mimic a medical emergency and kill her. By now, Charlie had perfected his ability to kill undetected. He'd often target those who seemed most vulnerable, patients with conditions that could just mask his murders. And what was truly horrifying is that Charlie didn't seem to have a specific motive. Sometimes his choice of victim seemed completely random. I suppose just driven by his want and need for control over life and death. At one point, Charlie just went a bit... He just really didn't care, and he started tampering with lots of different IV bags. This randomness meant that he couldn't always predict who would be affected. I've got no doubt this probably heightened his sense of power and allowed him to continue murdering without any kind of fear of being found out. But after Edna's death, and after all of these tampered with IV bags, his behaviour, his suspicious behaviour, became harder for staff to ignore. And the staff at several hospitals, including Morris Memorial Town, where he was currently working, they had begun to notice suspicious spikes in unexplained deaths whilst Charlie was on shift. But rather than investigating thoroughly, administrators chose to avoid the case. Like I mentioned earlier, they were worried about being sued. They didn't want that kind of thing linked to their hospital. They didn't want it to damage their reputation. Instead of being fired or reported to authorities, Charlie was just asked to move, to resign quietly, and he'd simply go on to the next hospital and do it all over again. And in this case, he got a job at the next hospital where he began using drugs like, I'm actually not going to try and say this word because I don't know how to say it, vecuronium bromide, maybe. It's something that's used to relax the muscles during surgery or intubation. But if it's dosed in an incorrect way, then it can actually stop breathing entirely. It basically leads to you dying by suffocation. How horrific is that? One of his victims during this period was a man called Sam Spicer, and he was a former firefighter, and he'd been admitted for complications following a routine surgery. Sam had spent his life saving others, and now he was vulnerable. He was relying on the medical team to keep him safe. But Charlie, of course, saw this as an opportunity. Late one night, Charlie entered Sam's room and he injected his IV with this drug. It would have slowly paralysed Sam's diaphragm and eventually made it impossible for him to breathe. He likely gasped for air before eventually just succumbing. And his death was actually listed as post-surgical complications. And of course, we know that it was Charlie's doing. But after that, he was free to move on. Charlie moved to a final centre in 1998, and he would continue his pattern of targeting the vulnerable. He continued using digoxin, but sometimes there was a kind of added twist with what he would do. Sometimes he would administer doses that weren't quite lethal, and this would leave the patient suffering and create a window where he could swoop in and either act as hero or executioner. Horrific. Now, one of his victims during this time was a woman called Matilda Kleiner. She was a grandmother, she was in her late 80s, and she had had a fall and then been admitted to the hospital. Matilda's condition was stable, but very mysteriously, her heart started to fail after Charlie had come in and seen her. He had been giving her small increments of this digoxin medication, and over the next few days, her health declined, and she would have been in excruciating pain when she did eventually die. Now, Matilda's family really pushed for answers. They knew that she was supposed to be in there, looked after, and then leave alive. She was on the road to recovery when she'd suddenly died. But this centre, it was actually a nursing home, they had just completely dismissed her concerns, saying that this death was from natural causes. Charlie was yet again protected by institutional silence. And so he moved on with no consequences. It was in the early 2000s that, I think a minute ago I said that he went on to his final hospital. That was a care home. This was actually his final hospital, and he kind of escalated still. Reports suggest that he began contaminating saline bags with digoxin and also with insulin, and he would just leave them on supply carts for any nurse to use. This method, again, had this terrifying dynamic that, of course, patients could die at complete random. Charles hadn't treated them. There was no real link to them. One woman who died, one victim, was a mother of 3 called Gloria Iglesias. She'd been in hospital for a few days after an operation, and her condition began to get worse without any explanation. Her family, who were by her side, were completely shocked when she slipped into cardiac arrest. She died, and what they didn't know was that she had been attached to an IV, and she had been the unfortunate victim of Charlie again. What made this tactic especially dangerous was the ripple effect. Other staff members unknowingly administered the tainted bags, and they would spread deaths across the hospital, and they'd be obscuring Charlie's direct involvement. But with this method, it is particularly confusing for me, I think, to understand, because with most killers, or certainly a lot of killers, especially those who kill multiple people, there's the want to hurt, the want to see their victims suffer. With Charlie, he's just doing the fatal thing, but then he is leaving without actually seeing it happen. He's going to know people are going to die, but he's not actually going to be around to see his work come to fruition. I don't know what his motivation is there. What is he getting out of it? For nearly 2 decades, Charlie evaded detection, shielded by this systemic failure. But in the early 2000s, his increasingly brazen actions finally caught up with him. This was thanks to a combination of suspicious colleagues and an institution that literally could not ignore the mounting evidence against him anymore. In 2002, Charlie had been working at Somerset Medical Centre in New Jersey. Oh my goodness, this is yet another hospital. Apologies, this is the final one. There's so many names of hospitals, and he literally worked at so many. So his body count had grown. He was continuing to use digoxin and insulin to kill patients, but it was at Somerset that his methods began to really attract attention. The hospital staff had started noticing this really unusual trend where patients who were seemingly stable would unexpectedly die, and Charlie would always be on shift, he'd be around, he'd be there. And it's reported, this is a bit odd, this is very weird, it's reported that some of the nurses that were on shift with him jokingly referred to him as the angel of death. To be honest, I think it's probably an attempt to kind of make sense of what was happening. It's so unlikely that the nurse, the person that is there to help you, to care for you, would be inclined to kill you. They would be the reason that you're dying. I was just trying to work out why the nurses would joke about this, why it was a kind of known thing, why they wouldn't be fighting to get him found out. But I think the nickname is, and this kind of jokey element, just talk more so about this culture of fear and denial within hospitals. It's understandable that staff would be hesitant to outright accuse him though, because back then I was reading about hospitals and notations, and it seems that they didn't really track medications in the same way that they do today. So there was room for some slip-ups. Even with those patterns emerging and Charlie always being around, they would have needed more concrete evidence than just like feelings or anecdotes. And also speaking out against a colleague, particularly in an environment where whistleblowers faced real retaliation or were just outright ignored, that was always going to be a risk. And that's not me excusing them not saying anything or just kind of fobbing it off, but also in high stress medical environments, this kind of dark humour is going to be the kind of thing that some people use to process trauma. The process of jokingly calling him the angel of death might have been a way to mask the unease. I don't know. My partner always says that I jump to the defence of people generally. And look, I'm never going to jump to the defence of a murderer. But I think in this case, in that situation, I think they would have wanted to stop him. If they had the suspicions and they had the evidence, then they would have done something about it. But oftentimes, and I think this is one of those cases, there are so many more factors at play. It's complex and it's nuanced, and I think it's really important to understand the kind of full picture of it so that we can learn from it, so it doesn't happen again. Without the full picture, there's no progression, I don't think. Anyway, that being said, sometimes all it takes is one person who maybe is around it a little bit more when more incidents happen, someone who knows more about the situation, someone who can start to piece it all together. And in this case, that person was a female nurse called Amy. She was a friend of Charlie's, and to be honest, at first, she had completely dismissed that this could be Charlie's fault, that he was involved in some way. But she's the woman I spoke about at the beginning. As people started dying under suspicious circumstances and more of them, these patterns started to emerge and she just couldn't ignore it anymore. Charlie was always the person who was in the room with the patients when they unexpectedly died, and his behaviours were growing increasingly erratic. What ultimately led to Charlie's downfall wasn't actually the deaths that were happening with patients and his kind of erratic behaviour, but it's to do with his mistakes with hospital technology. Somerset Medical Centre had recently installed this computerised medication dispensary system, and that trucked every drug request by staff. When hospital administrators reviewed those logs, they found this really alarming piece or pieces of information. Charlie had been accessing drugs like digoxin, insulin and epinephrine, I think that's how you say it, far more frequently than anyone else, and for patients who did not need those medications. The administrators flagged the irregularities to New Jersey Poison Control in October 2003. Poison Control immediately suspected foul play, and they warned the hospital that they might have a serial killer on their hands. But instead of taking swift action, come on guys, the medical centre hesitated. Of course, they probably feared the legal ramifications, all of that kind of thing, reputation, but they failed to do anything. But it's not just them who had been flagged that this was happening. The authorities had as well. And so in 2003, police launched their own investigation into what was happening. And that is when they went to Amy and they presented her with the files, the charts, the statistics were right there on the paper. And although Amy was hesitant at first to believe that Charlie could have done this, with those patterns in front of her, her trust in her friend began to crumble. But investigators needed her to help gather some evidence. And ultimately she did agree. She realised that without her cooperation, Charlie could continue on and he might never be stopped. The plan was simple, but it was risky. Amy would meet with Charlie in public and she would wear this concealed wire to record their conversations. She had to play the role of concerned friend, someone curious but not accusatory. She needed to coax him into revealing his guilt. Amy's first meeting with Charlie took place in a diner, and it was of course incredibly stressful, oh my goodness, and tense for Amy. So as she sat across from him, her heart was pounding. She tried to maintain this level of calm. She knew that if he suspected anything, he could become unpredictable, even violent. The wire captured Charlie making quite vague admissions about his actions. Now, he didn't outright confess to murder, but his words hinted at his dark motives. At one point he said, quote, "People aren't suffering anymore because of what I do." Now, this recorded conversation was actually enough to solidify investigators their case. And so armed with those recordings alongside the damning evidence from the medication logs, police felt confident that they could arrest him. Now, during their last recorded meeting, Charlie apparently grew suspicious. Amy described feeling as though he might be onto her, but she did manage to deflect his questions and maintain this kind of illusion of friendship. She did that until the last moment, until she managed to shoot out of there to safety. Her cooperation led directly to Charlie being arrested on the 12th of December 2003. Now, unsurprisingly, at first he denied any wrongdoing, and he did that for the weeks following his arrest. But then Charlie shocked investigators when he actually did give them a partial confession.
We're here this afternoon in the Major Crimes Unit interview room. With us is Mr. Charles Cullen, and we're here today for the purpose of obtaining a voluntary tape statement from Mr. Cullen pertaining to the death of Reverend Florian Gow, which occurred at Somerset Medical Center on June 28th of 2003. We are also here to speak to Mr. Cullen in reference to several other deaths that occurred at Somerset Medical Center and other medical and healthcare facilities.
He admitted to killing at least 40 patients over his 16-year nursing career. He was really fuzzy on the details, and when they pressed him, he claimed that he couldn't remember the names of everyone that he had killed. Some murders, he explained, kind of blurred together, making this body count just impossible to determine. What stood out most was his reasoning, though. Charlie claimed that he was only doing this out of mercy, and that he wanted to end the suffering of the patients who were terminally ill. But this angel of mercy narrative quickly unravelled. It made no sense when they started actually asking him questions about it. We know there were loads of victims who weren't terminally ill, who weren't in pain. They were recovering. Some of them were expected to go home within days. Of course, Charlie's actions were way more about control and evil rather than any form of compassion. Now, the reason Charlie did admit to all of those murders was because of a plea deal that he made. He wanted the death penalty off the table. The man who has killed over 40 people was too scared to die himself. Horrible human being. Now, by this time, his plea deal hearing was taking place in 2004. He'd actually confessed to killing 29 people, although he said that he couldn't be sure about that number, and he had spoken about over 40 people. But investigators believed that the real number was much, much higher. Some said as high as 300. Ultimately, Charlie was sentenced to 11 consecutive life sentences, of course without the possibility of parole, totaling 397 years. In response to the murders, a number of states began enacting some laws that basically aimed at closing these loopholes and preventing future cases like Charlie's. Some things that have been enacted are things like hospitals requiring to report healthcare workers that are suspected of misconduct. If they fail to do that, they could lose their accreditation. I cannot believe that wasn't a thing before, but that's what this case did. There's also been improved centralised databases, so disciplinary actions, complaints, employment backgrounds, things like that, they can be just better tracked, I suppose. But as we know from some recent cases, there are lots of hospitals that still prioritise protecting their reputation, protecting not being sued, over patient safety. And not even all US states have taken on this reporting requirement. So there are inconsistencies and holes in these improvements. Today, Charlie sits in that New Jersey prison serving 11 consecutive life sentences. But for many of his victims' families, they feel like the system didn't provide justice for their loved ones. They walked into hospital seeking care, seeking safety, only to meet an angel of death disguised in scrubs. The scariest part for me, I think, is that he got away with this for years and no one really noticed him. There might have been suspicion, but it went on for so long and no one did anything about it. It makes me wonder how many other Charlie Cullens are out there. We hear of this now occasionally coming to the forefront of the media with Lucy Letby and Dr. Death, many other people as well. So I'm sure there have to be other people out there doing this that we just don't know about. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Red Rum. I appreciate you being here. So today I have a recommendation for you. It's actually something that came for me. I pre-ordered this like 3 months ago. It is an Australian baker called Brookie. You might have heard of her. She is Insta famous. She's amazing and her recipes are incredible. I made this brownie the other day, which was unreal. Yeah, obviously I bake a lot. I love food so much, especially sweet treats, and yeah, I just love this. I mean, she definitely doesn't need me talking on Red Rum about her. She's super popular, but I wanted to recommend it because I love it, so I thought you might. Anyway, other than that, I will see you next week every time. I'll see you in a few days for another episode of Red Rum. Bye.